The decision on the part of the United Nations Human Rights Council to vote a mandate to establish a commission of inquiry on human rights in North Korea was really a quite extraordinary development. And to understand it, it's worthwhile to go back a bit to the history of the Human Rights Council and what its activities on human rights have been. Up until about 2004, 2005, it really didn't do that much, in part because the Human Rights Council itself had members who were themselves human rights violators. And the United States and the other democracies didn't pay much attention to it because they didn't think it was worthwhile to operate through the council. But starting in the mid-2000s, the advanced industrial states in the United States started to pay more attention to the Human Rights Council and try to put together coalitions of countries that were interested in seriously considering the human rights situations in countries that had been very gross violators of human rights. And one of the first developments that came out of that was the creation of individual country mandates, where the Human Rights Council mandated investigation and special rapporteurs to monitor human rights activities in countries that were believed to have gross human rights violations. Interestingly, North Korea was one of the countries to receive that kind of special mandate, and it has had a special rapporteur on human rights since 2004. And of course, the special rapporteur has never visited North Korea. But I have to confess, I was personally surprised when the Human Rights Council in early 2013 took a decision by consensus. And interestingly, at the time, China was a member of the Human Rights Council, to establish a commission of inquiry on human rights in North Korea. And so it's really the establishment of the commission which led to the commission report, which then led to the subsequent votes. Once the commission of inquiry was established, it was headed by an Australian jurist named Michael Kirby with two other members, both people with strong backgrounds in the human rights area. And one of the things about the process that Kirby set in place was the incredible thoroughness of his investigation. He was given a mandate to investigate the possibility that North Korea had committed gross and systematic human rights violations, but also to specifically consider whether any of those human rights violations rose to the level of crimes against humanity. Now, it's important to understand that the Commission of Inquiry is not a prosecutorial body. It's a fact-finding body which is seeking to establish the question of whether there may be grounds for considering violations of human rights that rise to the level of crimes against humanity. And so very systematically, drawing on testimony from camp survivors, refugees, secondary materials, Kirby and his team and staff worked through all of these 9 areas that he was tasked to investigate in an extremely thorough manner and produced a report which is almost 400 pages long. The North Koreans have been unresponsive and uncooperative with all aspects of the UN's involvement in the North Korean human rights issue. So at the time that the Special Rapporteur was created in 2004, that Special Rapporteur has never visited North Korea. Kirby's team did not visit North Korea. It was forced to take depositions in the United States, in Japan, and in South Korea from refugees, and conduct its investigation outside the country, though Justice Kirby was always very clear that he was open and wanted to have the input of the North Korean government, but they completely rejected the entire Commission of Inquiry process as well as the Commission of Inquiry findings. The biggest issue with respect to the Commission of Inquiry findings was the finding that, in fact, there was adequate evidence to think that crimes against humanity had been committed in North Korea. And because of the nature of the Rome Statute and the way that international human rights law has evolved, the implication of that is that individuals can be found legally culpable for the commission of those crimes. So this idea of individual culpability is a fundamental breakthrough in the way that we think about international law. So it's not the country that is responsible, it's individuals within the government that are responsible for committing these crimes. And in principle, those individuals who are culpable could be referred to the International Criminal Court for prosecution and ultimately indictment and detention, punishment, if they're found guilty of those crimes. And so the proposed resolution that was put forth by Japan and the European Union with support from South Korea and the United States and most of the advanced industrial democracies, all of the advanced industrial democracies, had this very important paragraph which said not only that what the COI findings had been, but recommended that the Commission of Inquiry report be referred to the Security Council for action, including referral to the International Criminal Court for possible prosecution. So this was obviously something which touched right at the heart of the North Korean system, because at the time the Commission of Inquiry report was written, Justice Kirby wrote a letter transmitting the report to Kim Jong-un, in which he stated to Kim Jong-un that he was personally or potentially personally accountable and could be held accountable for crimes that had been committed under his leadership, because it isn't necessary under international human rights law to prove that he was responsible for the commission of these crimes if he could have prevented them, And that's obviously, given the top-down nature of the system, the authoritarian nature of the system, is something that could have been done. Now, I should say there are a number of areas in the Commission of Inquiry report that had to do with starvation, movement of peoples, the abductions, denial of the right to food, denial of expression, and so forth. But I think the issue that's probably captured international attention more than any other in the Commission of Inquiry report is the condition in the prison camps. As you know, there is a large political prison camp system, effectively concentration camps. I think of them as political concentration camps that may house as many as 100,000, 150,000 inmates. We don't know exactly. Recently, we have satellite evidence that some of those inmates might have been moved and that some of the more notorious camps like Yodok have been shut down. But one of the things that Marcus Noland and I found in our research on refugees is that the abuses that take place in the political prison camps are actually pervasive features of the entire North Korean penal system, going down to low-level labor camps for minor violations or crossing the border or illegal movement within the country and so forth. So I think in terms of a focus for the international human rights community, the question of closing down the large prison camps and getting access to what is going on in the North Korean penal system has probably become one of the major foci in the aftermath of the report. Now we know the end game of this, which is obviously that the Chinese and the Russians, or the Russians, would veto a proposal to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court, partly for alliance reasons, partly because of their own concerns about human rights issues. But one of the issues is whether forcing the Chinese to veto such a proposal would itself serve some political purpose in highlighting this question. I don't know if it's worth doing that, embarrassing the Chinese in that way, but there is a case to be made that we should pursue that course of action. in part because the Chinese have been involved themselves in important human rights violations with respect to North Korea, most notably in the return of refugees from China back to North Korean authorities, where they subsequently go into the penal system and are subject to the abuse that is detailed in the Commission of Inquiry report. So one possible purpose of pushing the idea of referral, forcing a Chinese veto, might be to think about luring China or convincing China into reconsideration of its policy, so-called refoulement, return of refugees. I think it's important to look at some of the remedies that the Commission of Inquiry report itself left open, which I don't think have gotten quite the attention they deserve. So one of the things that the report suggests is the opening of a human rights dialogue between the UN or member countries and North Korea over the human rights issue. Believe it or not, the UN Commission on Human Rights maintains a technical assistance program which assists countries in building a human rights infrastructure. And again, it may seem strange to think that North Korea would accept such a thing, and it is in fact doubtful that they would. But there are reasons to think that such a dialogue might be possible, and I'll come back to those in a second. And then there's the question of whether the rapporteur, the UN rapporteur on human rights in North Korea, might visit North Korea, either to deliver the report or to actually inspect some of the sites that have been accused of, have been identified as places where some of these crimes against humanity may have been committed. Now, again, as someone who watches North Korea and is incredibly cynical about political developments in the country, I was personally surprised to see the extent to which North Korea was diplomatically engaged in seeking to forestall a vote on the decision to refer this to the UN Security Council for further referral on to the International Criminal Court. And I think the reasons there, we can all guess, they have to do with the sanctity of Kim Jong-un and the leadership and the fact that this was a direct affront to the leadership. But in the course of the negotiations to try to get the Japan and the EU to desist on the resolution, on presenting the resolution, the North Koreans actually made some very interesting concessions because in the Cuban amendment, as initially proposed, the Cubans suggested that rather than taking a confrontational approach to human rights in North Korea, that we take a more engaged approach. And it specifically mentioned the creation of the EU dialogue on human rights with North Korea, the visit of the special rapporteur, and technical assistance from the UN Commission on Human Rights to North Korea. So the fact that the North Koreans were able and willing to consider these kinds of human rights dialogues suggests to me that under this kind of pressure, it's not impossible that that kind of dialogue could begin in ways which would moderate some of the worst abuses in the North Korean system. Now, it's very hard always to know about how serious the North Koreans were about this. They may have seen that the resolution was going to pass anyway, and so these were gestures which they knew they wouldn't have to follow through on. But it is interesting that they at least held out the possibility that these type of human rights dialogues with Pyongyang might actually occur. And to get back to your most important question is what the possible effect of this is. One possible effect would be that if these type of dialogues were opened, and again, I don't think the United States or South Korea can lead this. I think this is something where Europe can play a very constructive role because it's greater neutrality with respect to the geostrategic issues. But if such a dialogue could open, then it's possible that the North Koreans would respond by moderating at least some of the worst abuses on the ground. And so no one in this community believes that North Korea is going to turn into a democracy or even become a competitive authoritarian regime anytime in the future. But if we're concerned about the worst abuses that are taking place, torture, illegal detention, the movement of peoples, rape, sexual abuse in the prisons, the prison camps themselves, if what we're really interested in is trying to reduce and mitigate the worst of the abuses which are taking place in the country, then it's not impossible that a dialogue of this sort would put the North Koreans in a position of trying to at least bring itself somewhat into conformity with the worst, with those standards, and dropping some of the worst aspects of its behavior. Now, there are, of course, other instruments that the COI has left open to the parties. One of them would include human rights-related sanctions on North Korea. I'm a little skeptical of this because North Korea is already an over-sanctioned country. It's not clear how many more sanctions you can levy. But there is the possibility, for example, of levying, designating individuals for sanctions, including travel, financial transactions abroad, that could have some effect at the higher levels of the leadership. Again, it's not clear that China would cooperate in the imposition of those types of sanctions, which would be an important factor if they were actually to come into existence. But we can't rule out that the UN Security Council could take up the issue of increased sanctions as a tool for getting North Korea to move forward. So to summarize where I think things are, there's a next round of all of this out of the Commission of Inquiry report, which has to do with the way this UN Security Council approaches this. And my hope is actually that South Korea and the United States, to a certain extent, pull back from leading this process. Because if we do, it gets tangled up in the thorny issues of North-South relations, the six-party talks, the nuclear question, and we allow either a group of middle-income democracies, developing country democracies, or the Europeans to take a lead and see if they can pick up some of the threads that were opened at the UN General Assembly meetings for creation of dialogue with North Korea on these issues. Again, I'm not particularly hopeful that this will come about, but I think it's probably the best path forward out of the Commission of Inquiry process. Well, the question of how the United States should handle itself in the context of these developments at the UN is a complex one. Obviously, the United States has been supportive of this. It's by no means been the only country driving the process. Japan, South Korea, the European Union have all played central roles in pushing this forward. The head of the Commission of Inquiry, Justice Kirby, is an Australian. The Australians have played a very active role in pushing these issues. But from the North Korean perspective, it's very clear that they want to portray this process as one which has the United States at its center, as the instigator of this process, as part of its hostile policy. And the explanation of vote letter, which the North Koreans sent after the Third Committee vote, was one that very clearly portrayed the entire COI process as basically driven by the United States, even though that's manifestly not true. And Kirby himself has said, I'm an Australian, I'm not an American, and I was given this mandate by the UN Human Rights Council, which certainly is not controlled in any way, shape, or form by the United States. So I think that if the United States were to take a very aggressive leadership on this issue, it will validate the North Korean concern or claims that this is driven by U.S. intent. And if it's picked up by countries that are not the United States and Japan and South Korea, and of course Japan is interested in this issue because of the abductions, which are also mentioned in the Commission of Inquiry report, then it will provide the space for a different group of actors to engage North Korea on this issue. And again, it's interesting that as a part of the compromise which the North Koreans were seeking, in anticipation of the third committee vote, they had agreed to the possibility of a human rights dialogue with the European Union. And they actually had held a dialogue with the European Union on human rights in 2003, 2004, but before it was shut down. And it was shut down, interestingly. The bilateral EU-North Korea human rights dialogue was shut down at the time that the UN Human Rights Council voted for the creation of a special rapporteur on North Korea. So they responded to the creation of a country-specific mandate by dropping out of that bilateral dialogue. But having the International Red Cross, EU observers, the special rapporteur, the UN Commission on Human Rights going into North Korea to discuss these issues, I think it's possible that these could have effect. It's too cynical to say that they would have no effect, because the North Koreans will then have to figure out some response to this dialogue. And if that means shutting down camps, even if they're moving prisoners, maybe that's better than nothing. And I think we should look for ways to engage. Well, one of the problems that both South Korea and the United States face is how to square the question of engaging North Korea with maintaining a focus on human rights. And you actually see this in the NGO community in both countries. The NGOs in South Korea that are interested in human rights are less interested in humanitarian issues. The NGOs that are interested in humanitarian issues, engagement, aid, health, assisting with agriculture, medicine, all of those sorts of things are willing to overlook the human rights abuses because they believe that the first task of humanitarian assistance is to help those who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And so this is just an ongoing tension that I think exists. There's no way that it can be definitively resolved. But I think it is possible to devise a holistic strategy of engagement, and the South Korean government of Park Geun-hye is attempting to do this kind of thing, in which South Korea and the United States continue to maintain their principles that that human rights are in fact international and human, that all individuals are entitled to the rights which are enshrined in the relevant UN conventions. And it should be remembered that North Korea is a signatory to a number of those conventions. So these are things which North Korea itself has agreed to, at least in principle, obviously, mostly in the breach in terms of observance. So it is a delicate line, but I think it can be done as long as we're thinking about, at the same time, other ways to engage so that the human rights issue isn't simply another brick in a strategy of cornering or pressuring North Korea. The United States is currently having a debate very much along these lines. There's a bill which is currently, has actually passed by voice vote, I believe, the House of Representatives, which would include human rights as a piece of the U.S. sanctions posture towards North Korea, and would try to extend sanctions, including financial sanctions, partly for the purpose of putting pressure on the North Korean regime with respect to human rights issues. And I think that on the right in South Korea, there have been versions of human rights bill that look very different from those on the left in the opposition to how South Korea should go forward in trying to square the circle between these two. But I certainly think it's the case that in the absence of some form of engagement with North Korea, it's very unlikely that any of the types of pressure which have been brought to bear are going to have significant effect. And so the difficult issue right now for the Park Geun-hye government, I think, is where does trust politique go from here? What are the next steps that would open up and get you to a dialogue? And my suggestion, which is controversial, I think, probably more controversial with the government than with the opposition, is that it's probably time to reconsider the and lift the post-Chonan sanctions on commercial trade, the so-called May 24th sanctions. And the reason why I think this is a little bit different, I don't think this is just a strategy of engagement. I don't think we should plan on a quid pro quo. But I think that opening commercial channels outside Kaesong could have the effect of forcing the North Koreans to think a little bit harder about their overall grand strategy with respect to engagement with the world economy. Because at this juncture, the North Koreans are in the position of being able to blame the poor state of their external trade and investment relations largely on the sanctions. But in fact, my belief is that North Korea's isolation is largely a result of its own posture with respect to trade and investment. And that if the sanctions are lifted north-south, that this will provide an opportunity for them to think about whether they can make the environment attractive enough to get serious South Korean investment. There's a discussion now about Rason and how the South Korean, a consortium of South Korean firms might invest in Rason more seriously as a transshipment point. That could be an opening wedge. But over the long run, I think everyone knows that despite the close ties with China, the natural trading partner for North Korea is South Korea. The language is there, the complementarities are there, proximity, a whole series of things would dramatically deepen North-South trade and investment if the opportunity were provided to do so. And that might be the context for getting a strategy of engagement going, get trust policy going, which I think, as sympathetic as I am with the PAC government, everyone I think recognizes is currently stalled and not really moving forward in a very satisfactory fashion. And the United States is really not in a position to lead this effort because with 2 years left in the Obama administration, a lot of other issues on the foreign policy plate with respect to the Middle East, with respect to Israel, with respect to Russia, I just don't see much interest in investing in North Korea as a high priority issue at this juncture. And, but I do think that if South Korea were to take some bolder steps, the United States would be in a difficult position because obviously there would have to be consultation between the two allies, but this would put the United States, I think, in a position of having to give its support to the PAC administration if it took some risks. And I just don't see those risks as being very large because trade investment is obviously reversible if those things were opened and the North Koreans responded in a hostile fashion. But right now I just don't see much progress unless someone is willing to take some risks. I don't think we can look at North Korea and say it's going to be unchanging forever. There are incremental things happening. They look small, but that was the way the Chinese reform started as well. They started in a gradual way. So I think we have to continually monitor these apparently small movements because they may add up to something larger. Now the big question is really whether the North Koreans can undertake this process of reform and simultaneously maintain their commitment to nuclear weapons. And the so-called Byungjin line that came in the spring of 2013 makes that difficult for the North Koreans to do, but not impossible. And I can imagine, I can at least imagine as a low probability event, a sequence that in which the North Koreans came back and said, we're willing to discuss this, seeking some relief on the sanctions front and a set of concessions with respect to their own security, probably Chinese security guarantees. Do I think this is likely? No. Do I think that the probability of this is high? No. But it's not impossible. And we should be ready to monitor these types of changes to see if they provide the basis for the South, in particular, making changes. Because again, I don't think the United States, despite the leadership that we're supposedly have,
is actually in a very good position at this political moment to place a lot of bets or take risks with respect to North Korea. So some of this is really going to have to come out of what the South Koreans choose to do. And if they choose to follow the strategy of strategic patience, then I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty, that nothing is going to happen. So if anything is going to happen, again, low probability event, it would probably have to come out of initiatives taken by President Park.